So thank you all, for having me. I love Cornell. It's been a place where I've visited a couple times. Tried to have a child go here, but they didn't want to be in the woods. So I very, very, very much appreciate. I always appreciate Jolene and John for joining us, and all of you for joining us as well. And I just wanted to start with this talk is kind of fairly new. It's part of a new book that I'm going to be doing on unsettling the settler terrains through visuality and culture and poems, particularly arts in poems. So it's a new project. So please, I just kind of refined some ideas around scale yesterday, and much of it actually comes from my time returning home and driving back and forth between Maine and here and through our territories and visiting and thinking about what it means to come home. So in some ways, so it's kind of changed some of my thinking around the visual cultures, but it also speaks a little bit to my attachment as well to California, where I am truly, truly attached. So today I do my best to speak this all with a good mind. This is the repeated sentence in the Thanksgiving address, the words that come before all else. I come to engage with good intentions and give thanks for what stories have taught me. Not just the stories that form the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee or my family, but stories that create relationships between vast geographies, peoples, and temporalities, both past and present, as well as those yet to come. This particular story will be about rivers and Indigenous presence. Connections among each other, native and non-native, and the states of enclosure meant to upend and control our relations. Now, I gave the class 2 readings today, and this is kind of how I'll be taking it and revising it. I figured it'd be okay because you read one version, another version, but you'll start to see how I'm tweaking it because they're both written apart from each other, and how I'm thinking it with the new younger scholarship that's also come out, particularly in Indigenous feminisms around water, which has incredibly influenced me by bright young scholars, some of whom are my students or postdocs. They've been wonderful. So I partly wrote this when in Los Angeles, where we see laid bare not only the problems of Eurocentric philosophies, but those constructed centers of power that form policy and construct our material surroundings. Tonawanda is the home of the Tonawanda people who have faced a long trajectory of destruction, from colonization to an ongoing mass development that results in continued climate change. Yet the Tonawanda, like the Haudenosaunee, continue to survive, thrive, and culturally resurge and make story, despite the violence and asymmetrical relationships of power. How to find strength in better relationships is a question affecting all of us, though far from equally, as we see the disproportionate effects of COVID-19, climate change, and the development across the globe that is ongoing and continuing. Facing a pandemic and a racial upheaval that, while it erases us in the visual terrains, is foundational to the history of where we now sit. I'm reminded of Acoma Pueblo writer and scholar Simon Ortiz, who ominously warns the reader, not as a lament, but as a prophetic, a request, and I think that's important to note, that the pioneers and soldiers who participated in the Sand Creek Massacre could have an alternative path to the careless destruction. Quote, pain and death did not have to be propagated as darkness and wrong and coldness. They could have listened and learned to sing in Arapaho. And I think that's really important. He says it's not as a lament for the death around a massive genocidal point, but as something to prophetic, to something to say and hold you responsible and accountable now. Ortiz, in the seminal work Connecting Colonialism and Imperialism, speaks to the relationship between Manifest Destiny, the Sand Creek Massacre, and the violence at home and abroad in Vietnam. It was written in the 1970s. And the after effects of limiting our imagination and relationships to each other as well. The limits of imagining connections are so often enclosed in various spatial formations at various scales from nation to nation state and territory, defined not as relationships, but rather scales made from raw power. And that's kind of what I'm interested in discussing today. Also the various ways that racialized spaces are constructed and normalized to the very scale of our bodies, so that many struggle to liberate and or celebrate despite the ever-responding racial logics pinning us down in constructed hierarchies. The scales of enclosure, of course, connect as well. That is, the body connects to the global, connects to the nation state, connects in the kind of a human geographer sense of scale here. That we see the colonial weight of living in nested sovereignties, a term that Audra Simpson really develops in relation to Haudenosaunee territory, and of inhabiting bodies that are governed by these varied narrated borders. Borders that are so often marked by rivers, which will be my point of analysis today. In the summer of 2020, I was traveling to my homelands in Seneca territory. I was going to the Iroquois National Museum, and if you've never gone there, I highly suggest a field trip for you all. This was after quarantining in Maine, a place where I grew up close to the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot people, or people of the Dawn. Our peoples have a long history of using waterways to connect to each other, to learn from each other in our unique particularities. Upon entering my own territories, I smelled the clean air of rivers, the pine, and the damp earth. We put into our spot upriver, which is in Solon, Maine, and I meandered down the river with my family and remembered all those places where we gathered fiddleheads and fished. The changing dam placement of the early 2000s had also changed the pace of the river and our favorite island stops along the way. This change in environment was done through tribal advocacy and that of local settlers who, despite their political attitudes and affiliations at time, understand the positive change in the quality of the water and the relationship to a subsequent return of the sturgeons to the river. And if you've ever seen a sturgeon that you can now see in that area jump, it's one of the most beautiful kind of out of phase temporal aspects that you can see. You can probably find a video on YouTube to look at that, but it's just really stunning and amazing to see the sturgeon return to those areas. And they're also good eating fish. They're nice, white, flaky, yummy. So generations of stories circulated, giving rise to connection between those with brutal past and sometimes brutal current relationships. On the way home, I also smelled the stench of rotten eggs emanating from the sappy Somerset Mill, a paper mill that is now owned by a multinational corporation originating out of South Africa. The smell lingers in the air as winds shift. I think about the place of the paper mill, so prominent because it is also the prime source of area income, and I also consider that much longer history of the river. And just full self-confession, my mother worked in the paper mill for 25 years, and she saw the destruction that many in that area have to reconcile with that being the source of income, but also that being the source of massive environmental destruction at the same time. And also having to struggle with worker rights, which I think I can say now since she's retired, but there were many threats that were made to the point, at one point, they were told that in South Africa, we just shot 20 people for asking for the same worker rights. So there becomes these moments of this tension that exists on that same plane where the river brings us all together within those temporalities, labor relationships, and all those kind of human geographer scales at play. So as I think about presence, embodied sovereignty, and I encounter enclosure, I think about the removal and all the way Indians become enclosed in a settler property logics. As I cross Chief Corn Planters Bridge, constructed in 2011 under the direction of the Seneca Nation of Indians, I feel the power of that dispossession, but the presence of knowing the history of Kinzua Dam with an awareness of an even deeper history, again, of this village area site, and a place that many still remember, especially the descendants. The civil planning of damming in the New Deal, in the case of Kinzua Dam, continued the bolstering of white town economies over the honoring of treaty rights. The presence of this history remains on the land and has continued, as we see in recent New York legislation, or in the Northwest as tribes fight their way of life and the salmon's life, which is also, as many conceive of the salmon as its own peoplehood and its own relationship that have the right also to the river. These are all intricately linked through the river. Our lives, the salmon lives, and these sorts of labor and legal issues. The legal boundaries with laws that apply differently to Native people were laid out acre by acre, subsuming land, water, and life. Inclusion under colonial law has not protected nor civilized, rather it has sought to define land and our relationships to it, which has only led to increased violence against Native peoples and economic poverty. Monuments and the visual markers of state boundaries draw our eye toward this seeming matter-of-fact ownership, right? When we go over the bridge of a river, in some ways that bridge acts as that monument sitting one side away from the other. Here I think of the really important bridge between the state of New York and the state of Vermont, which is Crown Point, where Champlain had that first French-Indian War treaty rights. And when you go to that spot, you realize why that took place there, because it had long been a place where our people had gathered and connected with those to the east, the Abenaki people. I'm like, when I talk now, I got to rearrange my directional memories. And that spot was because also the rocks themselves speak to how people could land and have large canoe parties on those rocks, right? I'm sure you can talk to Professor Parmenter about that too. You know. But so the physical landscape really engages history in those particular ways. And what bridges do also in relation to that is make a monument of these state markers that kind of at the same time erase. And there's a kind of monumentalism that this happened in the past, but there's still this way the river connects us, is what I'm working through here. So these oppressive laws are enclosed in America's limited imagining of itself as property owning and accumulating, not in modes of kinship and relationality, but ones of just pure possession, that raw power. So as I move over Corn Planters Bridge, I recognize the beautiful aesthetic designs and clan commemorations over the stunning sparkle waterway set against the riverbanks. As I walk into the Seneca Nation's modern building with powerful Seneca aesthetics that act as mnemonic device for a river of stories and purpose, I feel that power of survivance. This is the power of the visual, to recall in various parts of the senses. And that power is deeply tied to us being present on the land, outside these logics of enclosure. Presence on the land relies on understanding that you are embodied sovereignty. You a touch point of responsibility with accountability to the gifts that you have been given. I see the presence of the Haudenosaunee people of the Longhouse throughout New York with place names everywhere that reflect the power of place and language, even if it is obscured by colonial landscaping projects manifested through power, story, and artifact. In fact, you can go to any city and still see the manifestations of our colonial histories and our longer histories of the people around us that is often captured through language. For instance, in Los Angeles, Topanga Canyon, you might have seen that, Cayuga Boulevard. Anytime it has an NGA at the end of the street name, that is Gabrielino Tomvo language that still marks that place and marks village sites. So these are just some of the ways when we're passing these signs to really begin to think of how, what monumentalizing through road signs does, as Natachi Bluebard talks about in his particular book, but also how, what is it that we can do if we start to learn those sort of language components as well. So as one drives from Maine to New York, monuments of power struggles to mark each river and mark the boundaries of these states and towns. This form of monumentalism seeks to fix a viewpoint of history or, quote, ground a story in place, in the words of Blee and O'Brien, who wrote a book on monument mobility. Yet it is our poets and artists who refuse the fixing and erasure and remind us that there are different ways of seeing the landscape. Heid Erdrich, in her poem Grand Portage, slyly remarks on the century of travels down the river and Great Lakes. Quote, "Here is the path my people walked, hauling..." I forgot my PowerPoint, sorry. "Here is the path my people walked, hauling immense trade canoes, the semi-truck of centuries past." And the ways, she also comments about the ways in which those rivers become contained in settler imaginary. Here, quote, "Here reenactments and regalia keep history current, preserve trappers' ways, trappers' wares, and the era conveys." The politics of place are in the structure of the poem, upsetting a politics of preservation that would enclose tribal relations and stilted in time. Here a national monument arose by, and this is from the poem as well, "Here a national monument arose by presidential declaration to urgently protect Gichi Onagman's place and time." So you can see here, she takes Grand Portage, she provides the name in Anishinaabemowin, and in that name, which means the carrying of a heavy place, that becomes a really important way to unmoor it from the legal declaration that puts a national monument in place. Not that I'm against national monuments, because that can be a land protection, but there's often a lot of struggle between land rights groups, those working towards national monuments, and the understanding of tribal sovereignty in relation to those. And I'm happy to chat about that as much as I have some ideas about that, so we can talk about that in a bit. So as literary critic Christopher Lalonde points out, the author repeats here in the structure of the poem and points out that there is no sign that is recognizable. Rather, Indians are present in the poem, and Lalonde states, quote, "As a reminder of that rupture, the warehouses haunt the narrator. To be sure, in yoking the fur trade to the recently opened Northwest Passage, the poem suggests too that the transformation of the Arctic ice cap is bound up in the West Acquisitive Drive. This inconvenient truth is what haunts the nation and indeed the West." So here she's talking about kind of that haunting of the capitalism that occurs along those rivers, just as the particular paper mill that you see here haunts in a particular way as well those rivers also. But I always prefer to talk about native life, so we're going to get to that in a second. So Erdrich's poetry uses this language, in particular, native language, to provide an alternative scale to the visual narrative of this particular national monument. Now, Michelle Arai, in her work on early colonial photography of Maori men and of women, speaks about the practice of optics, making clear that it entails both memory and imagination. So here I'm thinking about sovereign mobility and what that means when you have, when you see or view something or smell or hear it through the various senses as well. And it's our artists that often can make this happen. But we encounter this on a daily basis, right? When I traverse over those rivers using my sovereign mobility, I also pull up that memory and imagination through the visual. So Arai reminds us that the colonial photography, however, entails three aspects. And colonial photography also can become monumental in the sense of how it tries to capture and enclose various concepts of landscape in space here as well. So she reminds us that colonial photography entails three aspects. First, that the space between the mode of apprehension, in this case the retina, and the object is not empty. It is filled with political ideologies. Second, that the consuming images can change a person. And finally, that the opticizing process itself can be violence. That kind of enacting of the visual, right? How do we read that? That can be violence. So what happens if you have a sense of what Corn Planters Bridge means in terms of one aspect, but then other people passing it might look at it as a relic of the past, right? Which can be a form of that opticizing of violence. In the circulation of images, especially at the height of Western expansion, all three of AIIS criteria were met in the context of the US and Canada. Consuming the politicized images of Indigenous people did indeed lead to a change in settler-Indigenous relationships, often with genocidal consequences. The presumably innocent eye of the photograph presented a reality that fed on the 19th century eugenics and scientific racism that nevertheless, according to AIIS art, is indeed the critical antidote to the damage of colonial ideologies. And here I've been thinking about how to incorporate this event. Has anybody seen Reservation Dogs? Yeah? It's amazing. So in terms of rivers and thinking, I'm thinking of the ceremony in which they present these older white men that represent kind of our colonial tropes of the preach, you know, the preacher, the mayor, and the governor all walk into a bar kind of thing, right? But in this case, it's like a secret ceremony, and it's not the Ku Klux Klan, but it's this like destroying of nature. So here there's kind of a river scene in which the visual impacts that opticizing or how you're looking at it upsets the political ideologies. Because they're doing nasty things with fish, I'll just put it that way. And so that you can't get that out of your head in a sense, right? That kind of imagery that's being created in that moment upsets the normativity of thinking of, the priest says, those Indians weren't doing anything with that land anyway. We're here to teach them how, right? And then they're doing nasty things. So that's all you can think of in that moment. So there becomes a particular way within that scene that's disrupting or upturning the kind of colonial ideologies that are damaging that AIIS talks about. It's very different than if you looked at the WPA narratives that of the river itself that was done during the Kinzua damming narrative. That's seen as normative. Oh well, the dams happened, those people were displaced, their belongings burned, and their houses burned that they had lived in for generations, right? That's seen as normative. So I think there's a lot to think about how we visualize the normative as well in terms of colonial land ideologies. So despite what visual and Eurocentric pictures present, Indigenous people in static time and contained spaces, Indigenous people are in geographically expansive conversations with each other and have been prior to any forms of colonization. The networks of kinship, trade, and conversations, while disrupted in colonial policies that attempted containment of our communities and very lives, are still very much alive in practice. Again, we didn't need the United Nations to have a conversation with each other as Indigenous people. This happened well before that kind of political formation itself. So we remember the rivers. The rivers are what brings us into those close proximity to each other. Contemporary photographic practices by Indigenous artists exemplify those ties to the past where wampum, beading, and other Indigenous visualities were exchanged and learned. Tools of the artist may be with current technological tools, but many of the practices of Indigenous artists demonstrate the ongoing threads of care and respect, not only for the specific community and their place-based work, but for the larger Indigenous communities as they understand the land and our histories as relational and connected across time and space. So this artistic rendering that we see here is water memory, and this is done by Cara Romero, who's Chemehuevi. This artistic rendering of landscape and play with photographic technology enables the mnemonic return to our ancestors. Immersed in water, which is our first habitat in the womb, we sense the energy of female motion and ongoing creation in Cara Romero's water memory. Here's a plug for you bees. There's going to be a really wonderful Haudenosaunee water perspectives with Agnes Williams, who is an amazing scholar, and Dean Seneca, who works on public health. So we'll be talking about water and health. I will send the information to Jolie. Well, she probably already got it. She can send it out to you all. I'm looking forward to that for this part of the paper. The dynamism of water and the vibrant blue play with colors and regalia create a network between peoples, times, and indigenous memory. In an arid place where water is sacred because of its scarcity, the immersion into the water that fills the frames creates an air of abundance of Pueblo life. The dynamic falling of Pueblo woman and man is reminiscent of another place where water is key in Romero's photos, Wishoyut, which is an inkjet print in the Indian collective Billboard projects. The way indigenous communities often see the world, and of course I can't speak for everybody or whatever, often upsets the landscapes of settler structures that enable not only land dispossession, but also land degradation. So in other words, many people in Los Angeles, and one of the reasons the Wishoyut Billboard collective that I bring up with Cara Romero, which is a different piece of work that I'm working on, is so important is because changing how people see Los Angeles as just a cement block is incredibly important. There's water everywhere, just the water was diverted and put underneath the cement, and it was diverted for developmental purposes so there wouldn't be flooding, right? The urban planning of Los Angeles is incredibly colonial in how it changes those relationships with water. So we also see with Cara Romero, who's Chemehuevi, there's massive land grabs going around in that era, particularly for solar energy power. So the link between that environmentalism and the relationship of water and her reaching out past her own tribal community, which is along the Colorado River and that border between Arizona and California, two places with very different politics, comes into play in incredibly important ways. A lot of the water is also being diverted for mining purposes, and this becomes mining purposes and the development of Palm Springs, Los Angeles, that area. So her work with water is more than just about that aesthetic beauty, but it is part of that, of seeing water as movement. That's that which is necessary to recreation. So the scale of play in these indigenous visualities pull us all into the frame. Indigenous photographers take on the small threads of life and the larger mythic frames. Here we see Jeremy Dennis's inkjet print that reflects the joy of dipping your toes into the ancestral pools of water, a feeling that can often produce an instant flow of ancestral memory. Yet upon closer look at the photo, I wish I had a pointer here, we can detect two smaller scaled heads popping up from the river looking forward to the large scaled embodied toes that occupied the focus of the frame. So we have the toes in the middle. This is Mushup. They're the toes of Mushup. Mushup is a giant hero of the Wampanoag. In his friendship with the people, he helped to hunt and fish, and this relationality took actions which created the landscape all around Heid. So it was the relation between the river and Mushup, this mythic figure, that creates all the landscape where the Wampanoag still have that relationship and still have that relationship contained in here. I actually really love this photo for its playfulness. In his friendship with the people, he helped that to hunt and fish, and that became part of how they have this ongoing relationship as well. The use of traditional landscape photos and photographs to render an artistic version of the narrative captures the landscape which positions the first peoples of Heid in a relationship to the land apart from colonialism. As many of the photographs suggest that I'm looking at here, indigenous visualities play with the landscape might be as iconic or an eventful scale, but can also just exist in that everyday practice. Many indigenous visualities speak to both forms of colonial impact and the network of relationships that it interrupted, but also those mythic possibilities of continuing those relationships on an everyday basis, either through the senses or moving through particular land. In addressing the scale of Indigenous art, circulation, and expectations, Ricard speaks of her curatorial work at National Museum of the American Indian, the NMAI, and the misunderstanding that sovereignty manifests only in law or recognition of the settler state of a small territory that we now find ourselves occupying. She explains, quote, "A narrow interpretation of sovereignty based on Western legal jurisprudence, therefore, does not represent Haudenosaunee foundational concepts of natural law, nor does it adequately address intellectual, cultural, artistic, and visual expansions of the concept." So while I understand the need of the law to somewhat protect what territories we have, I know many, many people across Canada, the US, that continue to try to protect and work with and have a relationship with the land that's not under federal protection. So that evidence is very real on the everyday basis. So in other words, if we think about the scales of river and we think about the different scales, there's much more beyond that of the legal cartographic federal scale of how, you know, Indian territory is bounded and enclosed, right? But that relies on us practicing our embodied sovereignty and our sovereign mobility to continue to have those relationships to the landscape around us. In other words, Ricard visualizes and manifests sovereignty in the everyday practices of Indigenous engagement with the world, not just in the settler-colonizer Indigenous binary, right? Her expansion of the topic of sovereignty enables Indigenous mobility and art practice. Sinajani, Hulea Sinajani, that we see here, who is Tuskegee, Dene, Seminole, and Muskogee, is just one example of an artist who invokes that expansive form of inherent visual sovereignty that Ricard unpacks in the Countering Indigenous Containment at the well-known museum. I analyze here settler grammar and the photographic memoirs of Aboriginal savant living on occupied land. It's a very messy title, but it's a very messy topic. So she says, unpacking its collective aim in the visual in the text. Artists create these visual terrains. Quote, "In the life of an Aboriginal savant, we must pay attention to not only the infinite number of storylines and colonialism by extending our point of view outward." These are from what you see on the left-hand side here. But we must also account for the collision of colonial storylines with the story of survivance to upset the foreclosing of possibilities. Thus, in thinking about a river's ebb and flow, people go up the river, people go down the river, right? We cannot foreclose the possibility of the river, even though the river itself is oftentimes meant to make state boundaries, country boundaries. We can think about what the operations of the Great Lakes do between Canada and the US. We can think about the Rio Grande. That river, and this is not often talked about, but that river is continually shifting. There's a current grad student at UCLA, Alana Hanosa, who's writing about the shifting river to the point it shifted where people had a choice to live on the Mexico side or the US side and moved to the other river. It's very good work. Very historical. So the connection between individual sight and community foresight is key to exerting a form of inherent visual sovereignty that follows Deloria's understanding of sovereignty as, quote, an open-ended process. And here I'm not talking about Phil Deloria. I know you young ones read the current Delorias. I'm talking here particularly about Vine Deloria, but if you read Ella Deloria's work, she very much always has this use of language and thinking of sovereignty and peoplehood more so as this open-ended process. It was her goal in her work. Indigenous visualities in poetry often plays with historical and contemporary imaginings of Indigenous people, our more than human relatives, and our lands to assert visualities rooted in Indigenous sovereignties. Indeed, in photographic memoirs, Sinajani's example of landscape photography refuses to uproot and evacuate Indigenous people. Instead, a woman is photographed quite literally growing up from the ground, looking up to the sky world. A remark on Indigenous women's continual creation despite the violence of attempted removal that targeted our bodies in, quote, vermilion lust. I also just love this photograph. I think it's really brilliantly done. And it's funny. I like funny things. So, on the contrary, we also have Mercedes Dorme, who provides a bodiless photo in Nest of Apparitions, taken at her grandparents' land site and in her traditional territory of Tonawanda. One of the reasons that land site is protected is because it is held in private property, right, that has not been developed or been refused to be developed. Very few people post the 1850 land claims in California were able to keep their land. So that's been a big thing. The red yarns here are symbolic in her photography, connecting memory of ancestral place, tying her to the landscape that now has become private property. As a place where mass development of the land is an everyday threat and evacuation of Tamva ancestors from the narrative of Los Angeles and living people, I imagine the small nest provides a safe haven where she can hatch new memories and connections. The personal place of renewal refuses evacuation and disconnection. One thing about Dorme's work is that she often nests things and uses the red yarn in the ribbon also amongst traditional medicine plants as well. So we can see that here also, which also speaks to kind of an ancestral knowledge of landscapes as well. So as one river memory connects to another, I felt the presence of my childhood when I was going back and forth, my ancestors and my family. I continue to seek every day a better understanding of how settler landscapes become normalized, and also to work on the ground to construct Indigenous feminist relational models of building connection in and with each other, land, and the more than human. These models have been passed down and told through storytelling and praxis. I also want to be clear that praxis is part of that storytelling process, right? So using water as an Indigenous feminist methodology that, quote, decenters human exceptionalism and makes us mindful of our relations, Joanne Barker draws our attention to the connectivity and interactions between water, land, and air, between humans and other than humans, in the invisible world, in the context of other than seen realities. That's a lot of others, but that's the possibilities that exist, right? Through thinking of these photographs and our authors and poets and writers helping us view the world. Water emphasizes, not romanticizes, those connections and interactions as the principles on which the terms and conditions of our social, cultural, ethical responsibilities are based. Water is ever expansive and transforming. Even those architectures built with settler goals and science cannot contain its ebbs and flows. And I think of this now in relation to Puerto Rico, in relation to the climate change that the massive flooding that's occurring everywhere. When we look at a river, that was a spell type. I was like, rover, am I talking about Mars now? Y'all might think I'd go there, but that's a different paper. When we look at a river, do we see permanence that establish boundaries, as is so often been the ways that they have been used in the case of settler geographies? Or do we see connective flows, communities, and mobility that nourishes land all around us? What might a serious consideration of rivers as a geographic concept of sovereign mobility bring into play? The human geographer concept of scale as that which examines relationships among and between places in order to reveal patterns, often they're looking for patterns of hierarchies, could be useful in thinking through the ways we might flood settler enclosures that seek to fortify bounded structures through the visual apparatus. The river so often has become the site of visualizing these boundaries. I think it's interesting to think about how the river speaks back. Heid Erdrich's visual poem, Preoccupied, rears off these preconceived and constructed landscapes, incorporating Superman clips, 1950s advertising of commodity goods, landscapes, and new Indigenous artistic renderings of stars and rivers' relationship. The background soundtrack of intense music, newsreel sounds, and pop music burst through and merge and flow through temporalities, earth, and stars. So now I'm going to try to play All right, we'll just try doing that. I highly suggest you look it up. It's pretty easy to find. So I'll try to read like Langston Hughes, but his voice is much richer and better than mine. It starts with Langston Hughes' poem, "I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the river," we hear Hughes proclaim. Erdrich riffs off the epitaph, announcing preoccupied, as an old dusty door opens her visual poem. You saw that maybe in the poster. Demonstrating connections that racialized capitalism and settler colonial landscaping cannot control. "River, river, I have never ever etched your spiral icon in limestone," she proclaims, as the wording spirals. As the wording spirals against the graffiti and brick urban walls, while traditional housing forefronts in black and white until it becomes closer, larger. Eventually, this here will all be in color and present. It's not trapped in a diorama of a housing past. It is the river that connects past and future, land and water to other bodies of river. River, 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 our river, map of Milky Ways reflecting of stars when all life commenced. And so here we see the Milky Way picture, which is a river of stars, and she's making that correlation, particularly in that part of where the river lies in the architecture of Minneapolis, is very important to Dakota people and also to Anishinaabe people. And so this becomes also a proclamation of coming together, and it becomes a site. Langston Hughes particularly sits at that river because it also becomes a site of thinking through what the labor of Black people and Black people's humanity means in terms of that river, right? Hughes himself is connecting that river to the rivers of Africa and to the rivers of his ancestors. So what does it mean to be in that place and that rivers? And Black geographers recently, they're doing a lot of work with thinking through these geographies of what it means to be in North America as well. So the scale of the river in the poemeo is vast, not only across Indigenous and Black landscapes, but also in temporalities. It defies the social spatial orderings of the state in the poemeo, and bricolage of the poem questions our understanding of what we are seeing or seem to know in the act of visualizing a river. Scale is an, quote, embodiment of social relations of empowerment and disempowerment. This is from geographer Swengdigo. I can't pronounce his last name, sorry. Reminds us that this is the arena through which they operate, that empowerment and disempowerment. So when I think of how we can think about rivers as an empowerment of scales, I also think about the rivers to the stars. And I also, in that case, can't help but think that we're all made up of stardust, but also Haudenosaunee people knew that well before and have often talked about that particular concept. So, or philosophy, or just our traditions. So enclosures form these hierarchies of possession and dismiss previous ways of being and knowing. In Indigenous knowledge bases, there are vast understandings of gender and community roles and ways to relate to the environment that are key to the strategy of Indigenous resurgence we are currently witnessing. Indigenous literature and art are foundational to these movements, as they at once create relational understandings while calling attention to the damage done, as well as having a specific place-based focus and strategies. Mohawk artist and scholar Deborah Dockstader reminds us that the biggest lie they could have us believe is in our political, moral, and societal organizing. It is part of the primitive and no longer matters. Dockstader profoundly asks, quote, will Euro-based societies form the frame of our thought and creativity, or will we be able to see through the surface predomination to something more? And this is where Heid Erdrich's captions, she does a whole footnote to kind of explain the video, which is just really a masterpiece for those of you teaching or might be teaching soon. It's really a wonderful teaching tool to think of as well. This particular poemeo was written for Poems for the 99% and was based on the occupation of Wall Street. So what she's doing is upsitting those frames that Dockstarter is talking about, and she says, it struck me as ironic that Native Americans are just a bit more than 1% of the population. Deeply ironic is the idea of Native Americans who might sense their territories as occupied being part of a movement called Occupy. I think this struck many of us as we saw that movement unfold under that cement. And within this poemeo, she also has this moment where she goes into the cement and thinking about the word occupy and who is occupied, and she plays with the numbers back and forth structurally. So again, I think of stories as I travel through my home territories to come across a porcupine recently hit and left in the road. My daughter is renewing beating in our family and asks us to stop. As we gather the lifeless form and spend the morning harvesting the quills for earrings, I think about this creature's presence and the presence of our ancestors. The quill tradition in the Northeast connects to many traditions and can be also a point of storytelling that takes place while you're beading or doing that particular kind of work. So my mom begins to pull out ermine tails and vintage beads for her granddaughter and unravel stories told to her by my great-grandmother, who was her personal confidant. Right? My mom's white, so I want to be clear here. She's not Native. I'm not making her Native. She's very clear about that too. But she was a personal confidant of many of the elders. So stories not present are on the surface, waiting. And as we connect with the life of the porcupine, killed through technology and development, we connect with each other and honor these connections in ways that others claim are not relevant today. These reciprocal relationships enable Indigenous people to continue to flood the enclosures and to survive the destruction of our ancestors. They provide pivotal information on how to do so for the future. The nature of the relationship that look at connection, that look for meaningful presence of being, are necessary for all of us as we see the repercussions of not paying attention to them in our human connections, and especially in our more than human connection. Creating this presence, not trapped, pigeonholed, or unable to expand in settler logics of enclosure, is pertinent and necessary for all of us. We do not need an inclusion that is additive and tokenized, and most of all, one that does not uproot settler foundations. The first step in flooding enclosures is the willingness to take an anti-colonial move of putting aside the Cartesian map to undo the architecture of the US that relies on parceling of property, racialized capital, and imperial temporality. It is to take what Deborah Dockstarter says and see beyond the frame of lies that are in front of us. I turn to and prefer to use, and here I want to be clear too, anti-colonial for its praxis, for the action that is taken before we ever get to decolonization or post-colonial. Writing and storytelling, and I want to emphasize this, listening to tribal peoples are the anti-colonial tools. In this mode, and this comes from Keywords in Race that I wrote with 5 other women in the Keywords Feminist Collective, which is a very difficult, 6-page essay to write with people who had an accountability to all their various elements. We had to discuss the whole history of race in the US in 5 pages. But this is what the conclusion we came to in the end, that we had to try. And this is conclusion. In this mode, the answer to addressing racism becomes not imagining a post-racial world or pretending to be colorblind, but imagining a world of more race, more community, more being in relation, and even being in common with difference together. Right? So when we look at those rivers, we can think about what the river means, and I'm sure here you've discussed the two-row wampum. We can do that later. But the river also becomes that space in which we occupy together. And so how do we begin to be in common with difference together in those rivers? So we need, in the words of Audra Simpson, to have a generative refusal of the landscapes or the settler landscapes that frame our understanding. And what we see in even the smallest words from our ancestors, often this refusal. We need to rewrite, as Cacibaldi states, and above all, there's a need to reframe the understanding not only of how we have gotten to this point, but also how to move forward. Most of all, this means moving forward with creating a presence with purpose and intention and in relation to one another. What we refer to in Haudenosaunee philosophies and stories as a good mind. So with that, so let it be that way in our minds, which also translates to now our minds are one. Thank you. I wish I could have showed. And this is the end part. I wish I could have showed it because it's so wonderful when she says, river, river, I never, never, but that's not to say I won't ever, right? Which is like that point of possibility that you can have in those discussions.